Thomas Frears, a teacher at Lime End Comprehensive School, has been charged with assault on a pupil, Jonathan Ashe. The boy's mother has testified that shortly before the incident, Frears came to their house and threatened her son. But under cross-examination, she admitted this might have been a simple warning against the consequences to Jonathan of associating with people like Trevor Adamson, at that time also a pupil at the school, who was a witness to the assault. He supplied the younger boy with drugs, and his influence over Ashe appears to have grown, just as the master's declined. Frears pleads not guilty, but the fact that he struck the boy has not been challenged.
You are Thomas Frears of 11 Maiden Lane, Fulchester?
Yes.
Mr. Frears, how long have you been a teacher?
17 years.
And at Lime End Comprehensive?
12.
And for how long have you taught Jonathan Ashe?
2.5 years.
You gave him extra tuition outside school hours, I believe.
Yes.
Why was that?
You see, right from the start it was apparent, to me at least, that he wasn't really dumb, as some thought. He was just... It's not enough, do you see, just to give children more and better facilities. We've got to give them a sense of belonging to society, of contributing, do you follow? Instead of just lying at the bottom of the pile in some invisible corporation's workforce. That's where the comprehensives have failed. A real education, do you see, wouldn't produce people just to slot into the system without thinking. That would be a danger, wouldn't it?
What would?
Young people who think for themselves. The way I thought Johnny was beginning to.
Yes, tell us what happened concerning Jonathan.
Well, it seemed all right at first. I got him interested in all sorts of subjects he never thought he could be good at. Even the piano, which he'd been brought up to regard as a waste of time.
Was it a sacrifice for you to give him extra tuition?
Oh, no, not at all.
How did the situation develop?
Well, I believed, until the end of last year. Then he came under the spell of a group of older boys. Johnny needed to belong somewhere. It was only natural that he should imitate their lifestyle. You have to understand, in his eyes, it had more to offer than I did.
Ingrams, is this really part of your defence?
I believe that your lordship will find that it is.
Yes, well, I wish I shared your confidence when you propose moving on to more central issues.
Very shortly, my lord.
Very well. I'm obliged to you for sharing the secret.
As I am to your lordship. Well, Mr. Frears, in what way did this new situation manifest itself?
It began when I found out Johnny was taking barbiturates.
How did you find out about that?
Because one day I discovered him with his face cut up. He told me the older boys had done it because he couldn't pay for them.
Who had done it?
I thought we agreed that wasn't necessary.
Well, do you know who had done it?
Yes, but if I gave you their names, it would merely create bitterness and make the situation worse.
I see, as you wish. Did you do anything about it?
Yes, I went to see his mother.
And what happened?
She said, in so many words, that it was the school's responsibility, not hers, and that Johnny wasn't the only child she had to worry about.
Ah, yes. Now, this is the occasion that Mrs. Ashe claims not to remember.
Yes.
Go on, please.
Well, I had hoped that being beaten up might do the trick and change Johnny's attitude. I know that sounds a bit cynical, but... Anyway, I was mistaken. If anything, it was the other way round. He hung on to the group even more.
Did the extra coaching continue?
No, he stopped that. And then... It was the old story all over again. He did no more homework. He became completely listless in class, except when he was joining in campaigns against me.
What kind of campaigns?
Oh, they're too numerous to relate.
Well, give us an example.
Well, when one section of the class starts humming, and as soon as you go across to them, they stop, and another section takes over. Makes you feel so helpless.
Did you attempt to do anything about this situation?
I went to talk to Johnny's parents again.
Ah, yes. Now, Mrs. Ashe has told us that on this occasion you were sweating, as if you'd been drinking. Now, is that true?
It's possible.
Could you be more explicit?
Well, it was the evening, do you see, when I went there, and they weren't at home. One of the neighbours on the estate told me that Mrs. Ashe had gone to the bingo club, and they didn't know where the husband was, so I went to the nearest pub to wait.
And how much did you drink?
1 pint and a half.
Are you sure?
Oh, yes, because I don't drink normally. When I went back, They were both there, but Johnny was out, thank God. Then we started to talk.
Now, Mrs. Ashe has also testified that you were shouting during this conversation. Is that true?
Yes, but only because her husband was. He'd been drinking quite a lot. It was obvious that neither of them really wanted to know.
And what happened subsequently?
Well, as soon as I realised that, I was on my own. I could have tried disciplining Johnny, giving him detention, but that would have been futile.
Why?
Because if he'd attended, they'd have beaten him up.
How do you know that?
It was the normal pattern. He had no choice.
I see. Please continue.
Well, from then on, I knew that his individuality would have no more chance to develop. He'd just become a prey to the system. But what hurt was the fact that Johnny was acquiescing in his own fate, even laughing in my face over it.
Did you try talking to him?
Of course. But by then it was too late. He just began imitating my accent the way all the others do. I can't help the way I speak.
How many times did you talk to him?
3. But it's the easiest thing in the world to deny someone all possibility of communication.
Did you talk to him alone?
Yes. That's when I realized something. In the end, everything comes down to strength.
Would you explain that, please?
What do you see? I can't.
Well, please try.
As soon as Johnny realized that I was more concerned about him than he was himself, he became the dominant one. It gave him pleasure to cut all the wires one by one, knowing that it was I that wanted contact.
After all that you had done for him, you were hurt by that?
I shouldn't have been. People only hurt from fear or blindness or pride. Most of us can't live without that.
Can you?
After what I've done, I've got no choice.
Tell us what happened on March the 22nd.
That morning's music appreciation class was particularly bad. They only seemed to want to know about rock music, nothing else. And after it, when I came back with my coffee, both the speakers had gone.
What action did you take?
Well, I knew both Johnny and Trevor Adamson had been there all the time, having a cigarette. That room was a convenient place. So I asked them what had happened to my equipment. And Adamson said he never knew I had any.
And what did you take him to mean?
It was a sexual joke. But, when I asked them again, they just played dumb, as if they'd no idea what I was talking about. Then I asked Johnny to come next door.
Why?
Because all the time he was with Adamson, he just followed his lead. Even if he had given up the piano, deep down I knew he really cared about music.
Did he tell you who had taken the speakers?
No, that would have been asking too much. All I wanted was for him to admit that he knew but couldn't help. For him to be honest with me. But even that...
What did you do next?
I can't tell you.
Why not?
Because I can't remember.
Do you remember anything?
Nothing.
Mr. Frears, are you seriously telling this court that after the conversation with Jonathan Ashe, you remember nothing at all?
Yes, my lord.
You're aware 2 witnesses have testified that you were responsible for a violent assault.
Yes.
Do you believe them?
Yes.
Mr. Ingrams, continue.
Mr. Frears, can you please tell us what are your first recollections after the conversation with Jonathan Ashe?
I remember being held down by Adamson and sweating, and him saying, "You stupid bastard," over and over, and then he got off me when the headmaster came, and Johnny had disappeared.
Do you remember anything else?
No, not really, except the head suspending me later that afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Frears.
You tell a harrowing tale, Mr. Frears, for which I'm sure you have our sympathy. However, it has nothing to do with the charge. I propose to be quite brief with you. Firstly, on the second occasion when you visited Mr. and Mrs. Ashe's home, you state, or rather it is claimed that you said, "Johnny will regret it, I can assure you he will." Now, is that so?
Yes.
Nevertheless, you admit drinking a pint and a half of beer when Norman you don't drink. You see, I suggested that you really don't remember what you said or what took place.
I do. It was Johnny's future at stake.
Really? Well, let's look at what occurred on March the 22nd. Apparently you remember Trevor Adamson's joke about your equipment.
I said so, didn't I?
Did you tell Jonathan Ashe that if he knew what was good for him, he'd tell you what had happened to the speakers?
I believe I said, if he knew what was best.
Well, your memory seems good enough to recall that fact, but not what happened a minute later.
Yes, that's right.
Extraordinary. Where were you standing when this blackout occurred?
Next to Johnny in the storeroom.
Now, how is it you know that?
I suppose
Yes?
because that's the last memory I have.
Do you not remember telling Jonathan Ashe that he'd have to learn that once you start smashing things, there's nothing that can't get smashed, including yourselves?
It's obvious. Destruction breeds destruction.
Do you recall telling us about Jonathan Ashe's patterns of behaviour and how you knew which way he'd react in given situations?
Yes.
Is it really true?
Yes.
You must be quite a psychologist.
In a teacher, that's important.
Oh, yes. Useful at times, too.
What do you mean?
When you don't wish to be made to remember something you've done.
I can't remember. I've said so.
And we heard you.
It was the freath.
You say that you were the victim of a campaign of persecution by some pupils.
Yes.
No, surely, Mr. Frears, in most schools, it's quite normal for children to try and rag their teachers, isn't it? Wouldn't you say so?
I suppose so.
You
must
suppose so,
understand.
yes, thank you. Now, let me ask you something else. You've been a teacher all your life.
Almost.
Is it a good job?
You know what they say, it's like the Foreign Legion. We've got no past we want to talk about and no future we can.
Oh, in other words, you went into it because there was nothing better to do.
Have you ever tried living on a teacher's wage?
Nevertheless, you make it sound like a second-rate occupation.
It's a vocation. Don't you know that the illiteracy in this
Very well,
country...
we'll take your word for it.
You asked the witness, Mr. Golding. Let him finish.
I'm sorry, my lord. Yes, Mr. Frears?
I just wanted to tell you, see, that the illiteracy in this country is growing very fast. Most of the time we just concentrate on maintaining discipline. And if anyone learns anything, then that is a bonus. But on the other hand...
Yes, I think we've had enough of your educational theories, Mr. Frears.
All right. You make it impossible for me to explain anything.
Oh, that's not my intention, I assure you.
Oh, yes, it is. You don't want me to communicate.
Like Jonathan Ashe didn't want you to communicate. You see, Mr. Frears, I put it to you that on March the 22nd, you simply lost your temper, as you did just now. And that in a sudden outburst of uncontrollable rage, you struck a defenceless schoolboy with your fists, you half-throttled him, and when you got him to the ground, you kicked him in the chest. And I put it to you, this whole story of having suffered a blackout is just a highly convenient fabrication.
You are John Alexander Furness, and you live at 23 Free Lane, Willingdean.
That's correct.
You are the headmaster of Lime End Comprehensive School.
I am.
Were you called to an incident at the school on March the 22nd?
Unfortunately.
Will you please tell the court what you witnessed?
Well, it was in the morning. I was in my office when John Ashe came running in.
You mean Jonathan?
Of course I do, excuse me. His mouth was bleeding very heavily, so I gave him a tissue and asked what had happened. He said Mr. Frears had attacked him in the storeroom. Naturally, I went straight there myself.
And how long did that take you?
Half a minute. It's very close.
What did you find there?
Mr. Frears was seated on the floor against the wall with a boy called Adamson standing over him.
Now, what was Mr. Frears' condition?
His head was down, almost on his chest, and he didn't move a muscle or even say anything. I thought...
Yes?
Well, frankly, I thought he was in a state of shock.
Oh, my lord, that's pure conjecture. The witness is not qualified to give such an opinion.
I think that's quite openly admitted, Mr. Golding. He was merely giving us a compendious statement of what he observed. I'm sure the jury appreciate that he is not a doctor.
My lord.
Mr. Ingrams?
Lord, please continue, Mr. Furness.
Well, I had a few words with Adamson, who confirmed what Ashe had told me. Then I told him to go and took Mr. Frears with me to my office. We had quite a long talk there. Missed my lunch, in fact. He sat there shaking his head most of the time, and when I told him what he was supposed to have done, he just didn't believe it. Said he had no idea what had happened to him.
He said he had no idea what had happened to him.
Oh, yes, he kept repeating, "You know I wouldn't harm Jonathan." I don't like to say this, but he even cried at one stage. Finally, I told him to go home for the day, and after thinking it over for a while, I phoned to let him know I'd decided to suspend him for his own good.
Tell me, Mr. Furness, what are conditions generally like at the school?
Average. We do our best, but it's always a battle.
Against what?
Well, apathy, mainly. We've had a 7% rise in truancy this year.
Then there's the inevitable vandalism. That's usually just a matter of lights getting smashed and windows, but it means keeping a full-time carpenter to replace them, and even so, they're often smashed again the day after.
Do you have any idea as to the causes?
I can tell you one.
Mr. Ingrams, we seem to be straying from the point once again.
My lord, I'm attempting to indicate to the jury the conditions of stress under which my client was working at Lyme.
Very well, but please be brief.
Thank you, my lord. Mr. Furness?
We should never have raised the leaving age to 16. I know Mr. Frears disagrees with me on this, but when the number of teachers is dropping all the time and you're forced to keep on a majority of alienated, hostile pupils, well, in a class of 35, they just poison the whole atmosphere and cripple the rest.
Is Jonathan Ashe such a pupil?
Without question. And if they don't wish to stay, they should be left to go their own way. Frankly, I'm coming round to the belief that some form of elitism is inevitable in our society, natural even, because at the moment, ours is just a holding operation.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, I used to think my job was to teach, but nowadays I spend most of it on the phone to the probation people and the police. I've tried everything, detention, suspension, you name it.
With success?
I'm afraid there's no way except more control through tougher penalties. It's pointless being sentimental with the young because they're not sentimental themselves.
Are you and Mr. Frears at one on this point?
No, his approach is, let's say, different.
How long have you known him?
About 8 years.
Does he have a good record?
Certainly.
Have you ever received any kind of complaint against him?
On the contrary, Tom's always taken on remedial classes, or rather he used to, in maths, for example, where you end up just teaching basic English.
Mr. Furness, are certain pupils at your school in the habit of carrying knives?
Well, yes.
To your knowledge, has Jonathan Ashe ever carried a knife?
Yes.
How did you discover this?
I once had to make him turn out his pockets.
Do you remember when?
The beginning of March.
In fact, just a few weeks before Mr. Frears assaulted him.
Yes.
What were the circumstances?
I regret to say some of the junior boys have money extorted from them by seniors. We'd stop it if we could, but they're almost always afraid to say anything.
Well, go on, please.
Well, we know Ashe was one of the victims, but we hadn't realised that he'd started doing the same thing to boys younger than himself.
Do you have any explanation for this?
Not precisely.
Are drugs connected with it?
I suppose they are.
Mr. Furness, have you ever had reason to summon Trevor Adamson to your office?
Well, yes.
What reason?
It was a disciplinary matter.
Concerning what?
I didn't think this was necessary.
Or die, my lord. It serves no possible purpose.
Mr. Ingrams?
As I intimated to your lordship a moment ago, it is directly relevant to my client's state of mind at the material time.
Very well, if you will keep it brief.
Certainly, my lord. Now, Mr. Furness, what was the reason?
If you must know, I had him up for selling barbiturates. But Mr. Frears had no business telling you that. His first duty is to the school.
Not anymore.
It would be extremely damaging if that sort of thing were to be revealed.
And it would be more than damaging to my client if it were concealed. Why wasn't this reported to the police?
It's better dealt with inside the school.
Yes, the whole thing presents a pretty bleak picture, doesn't it?
Yes, and the situation's getting worse. It's a spiral that's getting smaller all the time. You see, it's not just that things are changing faster, but that the rate of acceleration itself is increasing, and there's no way we can keep up with it. Teachers, social workers, planners, none of us.
One final question, Mr. Furness. From your knowledge of Trevor Adamson and Jonathan Ashe, would you regard them as honest?
In my experience, Adamson is not a particularly honest person, no.
And Jonathan Ashe?
Slightly more so, perhaps.
Thank you, Mr. Furness.
How many times have you met Jonathan Ashe?
Twice.
And Trevor Adams?
The same.
And you're prepared to give us an opinion based on that?
It's not my job to follow up every one of 2,000 pupils. I rely on what my staff tell me.
Well, for your sake, I hope they're more reliable than Mr. Frears.
Spare us your personal observations, Mr. Golding.
My lord. Now, let's go back for a moment to March the 22nd. When in your office you told Mr. Frears what he'd done, you say that he didn't believe it.
Quite correct. He was horrified because he couldn't remember.
Or so he said. Did you believe him?
I think so.
Did you or didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Thank you. Then why did you dismiss him later that day?
I didn't.
I thought you said that you...
I said I suspended him.
Nevertheless, he was dismissed the same week.
No, he resigned.
Well, we won't argue over words when the events speak for themselves.
Tom Frears was a fine teacher. He did it for the good of the school.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that. Would it be fair to say that you're a person who believes in the traditional values of education?
Yes, it would.
Now, what does that mean, exactly?
It means I don't believe in anarchy. The truth is, if you offer a reasoned argument to young people, that's just an invitation to them to reject it. But if you give them a fact, they have no choice but to accept it.
And is that Mr. Frears' view?
No, he tended to treat them almost as equals.
And what were the practical results of such an attitude?
I don't like to criticise a colleague.
Oh, come, Mr. Furness, you answered my learned friend very frankly. You are under oath. What were the consequences?
Well, there's a risk of becoming emotionally involved with some pupils.
And did that happen to Mr. Frears?
I'm afraid so, and because of it, he sometimes overreacted in situations where a professional shouldn't.
He sometimes overreacted in situations where a professional shouldn't, yes. Now, what does that mean, exactly?
Were you ever in the army?
No, I wasn't.
Well, there are situations in which a civilian will panic, but a soldier will control himself no matter what the provocation. Take Northern Ireland.
Yes, but from your experience, would you say that many teachers are tempted to hit out at times under provocation?
Almost all of us, but that's part of the job. You don't give in to it.
You may not have, Mr. Furness. Thank you.
Does your lordship have any further questions? Thank you, Mr. Furness. You may leave the witness box. My lord, I call Dr. William Greenberg. You are William Ernst Greenberg of 39 Lancing Court, Fulchester.
Yes.
You are consultant psychiatrist at St. James's Hospital, and you have also worked at the Johns Hopkins Institute in Baltimore. You are the author of Mechanisms of Dissociation.
Yes.
Dr. Greenberg, what is your connection with the defendant?
He's been my patient for 3 years.
Now, Dr. Greenberg, in order that the jury may follow clearly the questions I'm about to put to you, would you please tell us very simply what, in your opinion, occurred on March the 22nd?
Well, Thomas assaulted a child. Of that there's no doubt. And in doing so, I believe he experienced a state of what we call, if you forgive the terms, hysterical amnesia.
Yes, could you please explain that term to the jury?
Certainly. It suggests that for a brief moment his body was no longer the servant of his mind.
Do you mean his conscious mind?
Of course. The other part is always present. In me, in you, whether we admit it or not.
Dr. Greenberg, are you saying that Mr. Frears was not responsible for his actions?
No more as if you kill an insect in your sleep.
The case of the Queen against Frears will be resumed tomorrow in the Crown Court.